On February 19th, they weren't. After the president signed an executive order to remove all Americans of Japanese descent from our neighborhoods. Frank Wada's family lived in San Diego and learned about Order 9066 from a notice on a lamppost near his home. Originally, each family was told they could have a truck and fill it up with their belongings and not to worry. 3 days later, his family was put on a train, not knowing their final destination, and told they could bring one suitcase each. When he died in 2021 at 99 years old, Frank still had his suitcase. He shared, "We were put on a train and ended up in the Santa Anita racetrack, where they lived in the stables for 2.5 months. And he added, they were dirty. Then another train took them just across the California border to Poston in the Sonora Desert. And with a population of almost 18,000, Poston was the third largest city in Arizona during the war. And for more than 3 years, the Wada family lived in this concentration camp and endured extraordinary summer heat, coaxed vegetable gardens out of parched desert grounds, and made a home out of the barest of quarters with no running water, no privacy, minimal health care. But years of anti-immigrant propaganda fueled politicians and newspapers to lead a prejudiced population to turn a blind eye. And so on February 18th, they were our neighbors. On February 19th, they weren't, literally. Now, the legal expert asked Jesus a question to test him. What must I do to gain eternal life? And Jesus answered with a story about living an ethical life. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And down, as in literally. Did you know that Jericho lies nearly 1,000 feet below sea level? In 17 miles, the road from Jerusalem descends over 3,000 feet, passing through narrow canyons and treacherous cliffs, which is a perfect place for an ambush. Like what happened to that certain man who was robbed, beaten, stripped, and left near death. But he was not the first, nor would he be the last to have such a frightful experience. And the crowd listening to Jesus knew it. I mean, they knew exactly what he was talking about. Some of them, or maybe some of their family members, had been victims themselves. And so they could visualize, that's me, lying nearly dead along the roadside. Who would help me? And while lying there, just imagine watching through swollen eyes as a priest and a Levite both passed by on the other side of the road instead of stopping to help. However, given how dangerous this road was, they may have thought, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? And then came along a Samaritan who reversed the question, if I do not stop and help this man, what will happen to him? Not what will happen to me, but if I don't stop, what will happen to him? Which is a question that Martin Luther King Jr. posed in a sermon the night before he was murdered in April 1968. People kept criticizing Dr. King for straying from his mission that others imagined he should have. They didn't like his critique of the Vietnam War. They didn't like his advocacy for economic justice. Stick to the race question, he was told. Well, he was in Memphis that night, and he told the parable of the Good Samaritan as a way to explain why help them. The them in question were striking sanitation workers. The strike had actually started in February, and it was in response to gruesome deaths of Eckel Cole and Robert Walker. Because you see, white residents objected to seeing garbage men eat their lunch. Picnicking, as those who objected called it. So workers were told to eat in the cab of their truck, but it wasn't large enough, so one rainy afternoon, 2 workers were sitting under the protection of the back of the truck. When that old broken down truck malfunctioned, once again, this time crushing the 2 men, killing them both, the city offering their families a $500 death benefit. It was their needless deaths, on top of indignity after indignity, that led hundreds to walk through the streets of Memphis carrying signs that say, "I am a man." All because residents didn't want to have to see their neighbor eat. And who is my neighbor? In his letter from Birmingham jail, Dr. King said, "We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, dyed in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be." Which, in other words, made perfect sense to him that those striking sanitation workers were his neighbors, and he couldn't pass by on the other side of the road. What would happen to them? The lesson, or at least a lesson, of the parable of the Good Samaritan reminds me of this famous quote, I'm sure you know, from Pastor Martin Niemöller. "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, but I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak for me." So the context of that quote began 1930s Germany. And at first, Pastor Niemöller didn't object to what was happening in his country. And like many others, he was anti-Semitic, considered Jews to be Christ killers. He didn't object to anything until the government started interfering with the affairs of the church. Even, and this was new to me, ordering a change to texts in the Bible that they called Jewish ideology. That's when he spoke out. But as punishment for the pastor's public criticism, he was arrested several times and finally sent to a concentration camp with others perceived as threats to society, such as Jews, Roma and Sinti people, gay men, and other asocials, such as alcoholics. And Pastor Niemöller spent 8 years in concentration camps, including 4 years in the infamous Dachau. He was liberated by American troops in April 1945, but whereas most Germans just wanted to move on, Pastor Niemöller insisted that people must confront what happened so that it might never happen again. And so that's when he used and kept using his famous words that still speak to us these days. He kept going until he died in 1984. Who is my neighbor? But scholar Amy Jill Levine actually said the question should be, who is not our neighbor? Now, the simplest lesson of the parable of the Good Samaritan is that we should all demonstrate mercy to others. What an amazing example he provided. But it's in their simplicity that the parables are often most complex, with multiple layers of meaning. For example, given the prejudice and animosity felt by Jews towards Samaritans and Samaritans against Jews, the crowd that would have in one moment identified with being left by the side of the road almost dead, well, they would have asked themselves in the next minute, would I want someone like a Samaritan to stop? I mean, really, the crowd would have been horrified by Jesus' example. And he asked them, would I accept the demonstration of mercy by someone like them? We see the Samaritan in such neighbors as Frank Wada, who, by the way, served in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit made up of Japanese Americans that was one of the most decorated in U.S. military history. Or see the Samaritan and the impoverished sanitation workers like Eckel Cole and Robert Walker. Or 6 million Jews and other threats to society imprisoned and murdered in Nazi death camps during World War II. But in every age, we must be attentive and ask, who are our neighbors? Recognizing history will repeat itself if we don't learn from it. Who is not our neighbor? But of all these complex potential meanings and layers and so forth, I see another one I want to point out today. You know the second great commandment of Jesus? The first, of course, to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. The second is to love your neighbor as yourself, which do you realize means to love and show mercy to our neighbors as much as we show love and mercy to ourselves. And yes, it's that second part I think we maybe need to hear a little bit about today. On Ash Wednesday, Diana Butler Bass said she didn't need a smudge of ash on her forehead to remind her of her mortality because we're standing in ash up to our knees. People are scared. Ukrainians feeling abandoned. Federal employees feel battered. Trans people feel expunged. Europeans feel betrayed. Legal immigrants are terrified. And what are you feeling? And so today, in addition to showing love to others, I think we need to give ourselves a little grace. Give ourselves a break and demonstrate some mercy to ourselves. And that is actually part of our intention during Lent. You've heard us talk about it now. We have the sound healing tomorrow night in the chapel. And then the following week, healing through art and color. And then healing touch, and then the history of, and then a service of healing, an anointing with oil. It's not selfish to say we need some self-care. In fact, poet Audre Lorde said, caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. But as Anna Ortega Williams wrote in Essence magazine, what we really need in times of stress like these is community care. She said these circumstances aren't new. And as African Americans, we understand what it means to be attacked on a mass group level identity, and we carry that in our blood. As part of our lineage and our roots is to understand that we're part of a collective. We've always had a sense, I am because we are. You take that term from Ubuntu. We know that individual self-care actions have never been enough. And once we realize that our individual harms and pain are interlocking, we also see that our healing is interlocking. Individualism has never saved us. Our wellness is multifold. And so, first, whatever you are feeling, you're not alone in it. And then, find community. The best self-care is community care. I like that. And you know people in your lives who need that. So spread the word to those in your life who feel like that certain man who was robbed and beaten and stripped naked and left near death, who lay there beside the road between Jerusalem and Jericho feeling abandoned, alone. I mean, you all know more than anybody what it feels like to be in a community of care. And it feels good to know you belong somewhere, right? But you know what feels better? When you can help someone else feel that way too. It could just be the demonstration of mercy that one of your neighbors needs. We could all use a little more mercy. You too? So the words of the song that the choir sang, the first time Angelica shared them, I just went, oh my God, these are so beautiful. I've got to turn this into a litany. And so to make sure these words not only are heard in song, but are spoken in our own mouths. Until Love is spoken by Karen Marawali. Grant us hope when all seems dire. Grant us faith to spark a fire, to fiercely burn, to drown the night, and set the world ablaze with light. And when we meet resistance and our call puts us in danger, grant us patience and persistence to stand up for friend and stranger. Grant us courage to be kind. Grant us singleness of mind, to free the world from hate and fear, so only love is spoken here. And when our path of justice leads us to the dreadful fight, grant us vigor and entrust us with the power to do what's right. Grant us courage to be kind. Grant us singleness of mind, to free the world from hate and fear, so only love is spoken here.